December 19th, 1995. The survivor's name is Marika Somerstein. The maiden name is Schoenfeld. The interviewer is Herbert Pasternak. This interview is taking place in the town of Lawrence, in New York State, in the United States of America, and the interview will be conducted in English. Today's date is December 19th, 1995. The survivor we will be interviewing today is Marika Somerstein. Her maiden name was Schoenfeld. I am the interviewer. My name is Herbert Pasternak. We are in the town of Lawrence, in the state of New York, in the United States of America. This interview will be conducted in English. May I ask for your last name, please? May I ask you to spell it?
Somerstein, Somerstein.
And your maiden name, please? May I ask you to spell it?
Schoenfeld, Schonfeld.
Your first name, please, and may I ask you to spell it?
Marika, Marika.
Do you have a middle name?
I had a middle name, I no longer use it. It's Agnes, Agnes.
Were you known by any nicknames?
Marika is a nickname.
So what is the actual name?
Mariana, Marianna. But no one would know me by that name.
Your date of birth, please?
March 31st, 1936.
What town were you born in? May I ask you to spell it for us, please?
Nyíregyháza, Nyíregyháza.
And what country was that in?
In Hungary.
May I ask you about that town of Nyíregyháza? Can you tell us about it?
It was a small town. I only remember a small part of the town. I was 8 years old when I left the town. So my memories of immediate trips from my home to my grandmother's house. She also had a store in the middle of town. She sold paint and groceries, and it was an interesting trip as a child to come from my house to that store to get candies. And I went to school. The school, we didn't have any automobiles that I can recall. When my father took a train to Budapest, we would see him to the station, and it was on a horse and a buggy. Not our horse and a buggy, that was the taxi in the town. We would go into the mid-town, and the horse and buggy would take us to the train station. I never left Nyíregyháza up until 1994 when I was taken away. So 44 years.
You mentioned that
I never played with too many of the children in town, only the Jewish children. That's what we were. It was a very close Jewish-knit community, that's all I remember.
Did you live in a Jewish section of the town?
No, I can't say that there was a section, but it was a very small area where the Jews lived. Our neighbors were not Jewish, but we didn't have any contact with the non-Jewish people in the community. They didn't come into our home, and we didn't go into their home.
You mentioned that your dad went to Budapest. What kind of work did Dad do? Tell us about your father.
My father was a businessman. He traveled to Vienna, Budapest. He was I have fond memories of him as a very elegant, intelligent man. He was slim, and we had, I don't know if you remember the stoves that in Europe have the with ceramics. I remember him standing always warming his hands. And the last memory of my father is when before we were going to leave this town, he had a little drink with me, a little sweet liquor, and I felt very, very grown at the time. And he told me that he will never come back and that I should take good care of my mother.
What year was that?
1944.
Tell us about your mother.
My mother was very beautiful, younger, much younger than my father. She was very angry at him when we left. Again, you asked me to remember prior to 1944. I have a problem with that. I can't. It seems that whenever that's what I remember, that year. It's like my whole life began then. My mother didn't want me to go to this Christian family that my father arranged for me to go to in case we were deported. There were rumors that we were going to be deported, and nobody believed it because they believed that the Hungarian government would never allow this. Although all the signs were there, the Polish children were coming across, we were hiding them. Some Czechoslovakian children, even in my own home, we were hiding, but everyone said it can happen in any other country, but never in Hungary. I had a very famous lawyer uncle who said it can never happen, the Hungarian government won't let it. My father didn't believe it. My father knew all along that it will happen, and he took precaution. He arranged for me to be hidden, and he arranged for my mother and himself to be hidden in a monastery as a nun and as a priest. And so.
What was your father's first name?
Laszlo, Lazlo, Laszlo.
And your mother's first name?
Lily, Lilly.
Do you remember when Dad was born? Or about how old he was in 1940?
44.
He was 44. And Mom?
And my mother was 13 years younger.
Did you have any brothers or sisters?
No, I was an only child.
The famous uncle who you mentioned, who was a lawyer, what
Yes.
was his name?
Bohm. Jenner Bohm, B-O-H-M.
Did he survive the war?
No.
You had mentioned that you did go to school. Do you have any memories of the school?
Prior to 44, 2 incidents. Learning Hebrew, to read in Hebrew and having very great difficulties. And playing with some of the children in the schoolyard. I don't remember a classroom. I remember almost nothing. Well, it was, I guess it was second or third grade, second grade, that I was in elementary school. But I do not remember at all.
Do you recall any incidents of anti-Semitism that occurred
Before 44?
When did your family arrive in the town of Nyíregyháza? Had they been there for generations, or had they come recently?
My grandmother lived there for, I would say in the 1800s. That's when they moved to Nyíregyháza, my grandmother and my grandfather.
Do you remember your grandmother's name?
My grandmother's name, yes. Reggie Schlesinger.
And how old was she in 1944, the time you were in?
About 45.
And your grandfather's name?
My grandfather's name was Jenner, and he passed away prior to the war.
You mentioned that the trip from your house to your grandmother's store was a very interesting one. Mm-hmm. Do you recall the reason why, what the details were about that?
I can't.
Okay. From your childhood, from that time, do you remember any special holidays, any special family get-togethers that might have remained in your life?
Yes, we used to go to my grandmother's for Passover, that I remember very well. Lots of children. My grandmother had 6 children. And we all went to her Passover. I remember Sunday mornings, the housekeeper would take me over there to visit. And all the 6 children were in one room, and I was the baby, and everybody was playing with me. See, I do remember. And I also remember my Uncle Mickey leaving for America. That was in 1939.
What was Mickey's last name?
Mickey Baum.
Mickey Baum. Why did he decide to leave for America?
Things were getting bad, and everybody chipped in. All the children and the husbands, like my father-in-law, chipped in and sent him to America.
He survived in America?
He survived in America,
And you were
yes.
able to meet him afterwards?
He's the one that sent us an affidavit and brought everybody to America eventually.
Do you remember the names of any of those 6 children?
Yes,
Anyone?
I do. Of course, Mickey, Bela survived, Elizabeth, Edith.
Elizabeth survived.
Elizabeth survived, Edith survived, Lily.
And where are they today? Where's Elizabeth today?
Well, Elizabeth lives in Hewlett Harbor, who was also interviewed.
Her last name?
Virani. Edith Stern lives in Forest Hills. She was also interviewed.
Okay.
Mickey is no longer with us. He passed away a few years ago.
And his last name was?
Asubam. Bela stayed in Hungary after the war, got married, and he drowned in the Danube.
What was her last name? What was Bela's last name?
Bela was also bombed. This was all 6 children. Yes. And then was another uncle, Imi, who came back after the war, found me where I was hiding when no one else was back. And he went up to Budapest looking for my parents and died of typhus.
What year was that?
45.
You mentioned that most of your memory begins in 1944. Was there a single event that for you signaled the beginning of the war?
The Yellow Star.
Tell us.
The Germans came in, and I remember all the adults were very nervous and worried. And we were told that in order to leave our home we had to wear a yellow star, and it was very scary for me.
The Germans came in on March 19th, 1944.
Right.
Correct? But prior to that, there were anti-Jewish laws that were passed.
Yes.
Do you recall, since 1938, or do you recall any of these things happening around you?
I remember my father being taken to a labor camp and my mother trying to have a doctor help him because he had ulcers, very bad ulcers, and we were worried about his health. I remember he had a very lucrative business that was taken away from him and given to some Gentile people to run. We were told that it will be given back to him, but that wasn't the case.
How was that business taken away from him? Did he have a license?
Well, he had he had the first factory where they were making canned goods. It was quite unusual those days for Hungary, and he tried to make it survive by taking in partners that were not Jewish. But one day they just came in and they said that take your coat and leave.
And
That's how it was taken away.
These people, they were Hungarians, is that
Yes,
correct?
of course, they were
This
hungry.
was before the Nazis came.
This was before the Nazis.
So what year would that have been? 19...
Well, that would probably be in about 41, 42.
You mentioned the possibility that Dad would be taken away for labor. When did the community start to hear about people being taken away?
There was whispers. No, there was no announcements, or nobody really knew. And even the Jews were afraid to talk among themselves. So one day, this one, we heard that might have been taken to a labor camp, and next somebody else. But my father was taken away. He actually was taken away from Nyíregyháza, but my mother got this doctor's letter and went to see him and got him released to come back home.
Tell us about that. Tell us how Dad was taken away, but then we were able to get him back.
Well, this was, again, sometimes we wondered, in retrospect, that it would have been better off had he been in a labor camp, he might have survived. We thought we saved him by bringing him back home because he really was a very sick man, a young man and a very sick man with stomach, always had stomach problems. That was finally the end. That's how he died in concentration camp, because of that bad stomach. My mother had connections with a doctor, took a letter, I guess some financial arrangements were made, and my father was allowed to come back home.
How was Dad chosen to go to the labor camp?
I have no idea.
But you knew that he was being taken away to a labor camp, and once he left the house, then your mother was able to arrange this special letter from a doctor.
Exactly.
And was successful in returning him to home.
Exactly.
The German occupation that began in March of 1944, you mentioned the law of the Yellow Star. Can you tell us what happened with that Yellow Star?
The Yellow Star was the beginning. It was the least of the problem. About 2-3 weeks later, they showed a certain part of the town which became the so-called ghetto. Our home became part of the ghetto. We were right in the center of the ghetto. We had a beautiful home, beautiful large home. And if I remember correctly, my mother mentioned to me, about 17 families were brought to live in this one home. One of my relatives had a problem being with people. It was there's a illness where you can't be social. She was kind of, she wanted to be alone, and she lived in our pantry. We were given our bedroom. My mother, my father, and I lived in our bedroom. My room was given to a family. The living room was given to 2 families. The bed, even in the kitchen, families were living. Next door to us, we owned the house also. In Hungary they have courtyards. And in this courtyards we had our home and another home. We owned both. We had a tenant. And this tenant originally, she was Hungarian, but she had some connections to German background. So she and her husband were entertaining German soldiers while we were in this ghetto. That I remember how before this happened, she used to be nice to me, the lady. After that, she never spoke to me again.
After the Germans came in March of 44. Before the Germans came in, there were Jews that were brought to the town from Poland, and children came from Slovakia. Did you have any contact with these Jews who had been brought in, or these children?
Just one child who lived in my home. The Jewish community were taking care of these people, and they gave us one child to take care of until the parents can be found, and so. And she was with us until 1944, and then she was deported with us.
Did this child tell you? Do you remember her name?
Eva.
Eva, and her last name? About how old was she?
My age.
Did she tell you what happened in her town? and how her Jewish community had been taken.
Yeah, she was telling us that they were beaten, and one night her mother and father just put her on to the street and said, go across the, it was like a little creek to get into Hungary from Czechoslovakia, and she just walked across the creek and on her own a child, and just until she found the first Jewish person that she could, and that's how she survived.
Did she survive the war? When she told this story to your family, did your family imagine that this could possibly happen to your community?
And my father could. My father always believed that this can happen. No one else did.
Is this what sparked the interest in your father to make plans for you and your mother?
Yes.
In case of a deportation?
Yes.
When did he start to make those plans?
As soon as the Germans walked into Hungary.
March of 44. Can you tell us what you know of those plans that your father had arranged?
They all fell apart. My mother refused to leave her mother. Refused. Said, I won't leave. My father begged. They gave me to a Christian family to hide me. 3 days later, my mother carried on and made such a scenes that they had to bring me back. Now you can imagine what it was to smuggle me out of the ghetto and then smuggle me back into the ghetto. And my father and mother fought too the whole time about this. My father finally, at the very end, refused to listen, and we were on the wagons. You see, the way they deported us from Nyíregyháza, they took everyone to a small little town called Nyíregyháza, where there were the trains to go to Auschwitz. So they put us on these wagons with horses were taking, big wagons. We took all our belongings and suitcases because we were going to have nobody knew where we were going. We were going to labor camps, that's what they said. And I was on this wagon going to the train. And we were going to town, and all the townspeople were all lined up looking at us. And I was sitting on top of this mountain of luggage. And the men and the women were walking. Only the children and the old people were allowed to be on the wagon. And I was wondering why all these people were looking at us. I knew them all, and they were looking. And I was wondering why they're not helping my mother to. And then my father sent word to this same gentleman who he knew, who he worked on there in that very same labor camp that I was telling you about, and found out that this man needed money very badly and wanted money very badly. And my father sent my aunt, the one that is in Hewlett Harbor now, with a huge bag of money. My aunt took me off the wagon, took me to the temple of town. I don't know how the two of us ever got to this temple, how we were able to move around, but we did, and we got there. And I waited there for an hour. And then I was told to go outside to meet this man. I already knew him because this is the same man I lived with for 3 days prior. And I went out, and I had to walk into town, take off my star, and just walk through town and meet him. The trouble was I forgot to take off my star. So I was walking with this big luggage full of money into town, 8 years old, with my yellow star. And somebody started pointing to me, look at that, that's Marika. And so then I remembered, I took the star and I remember throwing it on the floor, and I was told to walk into this huge movie theater in town. and he was there waiting for me. And that's how I got away from the deportation.
Your father had made these plans much earlier than you mentioned.
Yes.
Back in March of 1944. The story that you just told us took place at the deportations, which would be late May or early June. Is that correct?
Late May.
Late May is when you were deported. Yes. But your father made plans in March for you to be hidden along with your mother, and you had mentioned in a monastery.
Right.
Might you know some details about how Dad was able to arrange something like that?
Yes. While the people that took me did it for monetary reason, the monastery, the nuns and the priest outside of Nyíregyháza were going to, they just wanted to help my father. They knew him prior, they liked him, and they were willing to hide him.
So the motivation for the nuns and the priests, they were Roman Catholic?
Yes.
Was a humanitarian motivation. They were willing to hide you. Was there risk involved for the nuns and the priests to do this?
Huge. They would have been killed, obviously.
If you would have been found. Yes. You were successfully brought to the monastery?
No.
No?
No. My mother and father were supposed to go to the monastery. I was going to this Christian family where I was put in a bed and hidden for 2 years in a room, in a bed. It was from 1944 to 1945.
So back in March of 44, your mom and your dad were supposed to go to the monastery.
They never went.
And they never went because Mom did not want to leave her mother.
Right.
And you were supposed to go to a private family.
And I did.
Who were going to hide you, and they succeeded in bringing you to the private family. Tell us about that private family that you went to.
There was a grandmother, there was a mother, there were 2 children. The grandmother was very nice to me. The rest of the family was not.
What was their motivation?
It was for the money. I am grateful to them, they saved my life, but they did not treat me well. And I rather, that part of my life I would like not to talk about.
Well, we'll stop the tape now, and we'll continue with this point on the next tape. Marika Somerstein. Today is December 19th, 1995. We were speaking before about the sequence of events of how your father attempted to save the family. He had made arrangements with the local monastery to hide himself and your mother, and you would be hidden with a private family. You recall the grandmother, you recall the family over there. You actually succeeded in making it to the house. The grandmother was nice to you, but the family not so much. And prefer not to go into that. Your parents, did they ever make it to the monastery?
No. They never did. They were taken to Auschwitz.
So the arrangements were made in March, and the ghetto was dissolved towards the middle of June, and they were taken away at the end of May. Is that correct?
Correct.
You had mentioned during the break the bombings that you had experienced. Can you tell us about those?
Well, from the time that this family took me in till the Russians liberated Nyíregyháza, there were almost every night there were bombings. And because of the fact that I was hiding and they were afraid to be caught, every night when the airplanes came, they went to a shelter, and I was left in a bed under covers alone. And that is the most horrible part of my life that I can remember. Being alone in the dark and the bombings night after night after night, and I was alone.
How much time did you spend hidden in that home?
A year, a little over a year.
That would have been from the end of May of 1944 until
1945 and
1945.
liberation.
So that was the home that you were taken to when your aunt took you off the pile of baggages, walked you to the temple, you took off the star, you walked through town, met a gentleman in the movie theater, and that was the home that he took you to.
And not directly, but after a while. First it's complicated, but eventually we ended up in his home where he was hiding. The men and the women didn't agree on having me there, so it wasn't a pleasant. So it was a very unpleasant situation. They made me work very hard. They treated me like I was a servant, and the children were very unkind to me. So when my uncle came home, it was a wonderful surprise.
That was in 45.
But he died after 3 weeks being home. So.
Tell us what your time was like in that home where you were being hidden. If anyone would see you, they would immediately recognize you. Is that correct?
Yes, they would. Unfortunately, when I was a little girl, my mother sent in a picture to a coffee commercial, and we won the prize. And there were big signs all over Hungary of drink coffee, and my face was on it as a child. And everyone knew it was a Jewish child. So I had a familiar face, which didn't make life easy for these people that were hiding me, because it was just an immediately they would know who I was.
What were your days like during that year? What did you do?
Nothing.
They hid you in that special bedroom under the covers?
Yes.
Were you allowed to go outside?
No.
Did you read books?
Wasn't allowed to do anything. I laid in bed. Once in a while at night they let me go out into the courtyard late. Once in a while the grandmother let me help her cook. But basically, I don't remember. I did nothing.
And then you mentioned that last moment that you saw your parents, when your aunt took you off of the baggage. Did you exchange any words at that time with your parents? Did you speak to them?
No, nothing at all. I cried for my mother for a long time. I don't remember anything about that at all.
Not that either. You mentioned that there was one incident where your father had joined you in a drink of liqueur, and he told you that he was leaving, and that you would have to take care of Mom. When did that happen?
That happened in the ghetto. I was trying to tell you, I remember him as a very elegant man. He did things differently than most people I ever met. And he took a little crystal glass with the liquor and toasted me and said, I will not come back, but I want you to carry on and do things nicely, make things beautiful. And after that we never spoke about it again. He told me that my mother doesn't want me to leave, and if I remember now, it would be like he defied my mother by sending me away. Consequently, they both went to Auschwitz. My mother did survive because of the sisters that have been with her, who together they kind of took care of each other. My father was killed immediately, very, very, very soon. I think he was taken in end of May, beginning of June they got to Auschwitz, and by August he was dead. His stomach, he really had a very bad ulcer. He was taken to Mauthausen. By the way, I visited Mauthausen this year, and I saw for the first. Have you been there? Horrendous place, horrendous. I never knew that how bad it was until I just saw it. That's where he was killed.
How did you find out what happened to your father?
A friend came back to Hungary and gave me dates, gave me circumstances of how he was killed.
He had been in camp with your father?
Yes.
Do you remember his name?
The friend's name?
Yes.
No.
And your mother went to Auschwitz too, but because of the cooperative effort of her and her sisters, they were able to somehow support each other and survive.
Yes.
Did your mother ever relate to you what happened?
In camp? Yes, as a matter of fact, quite a bit. My mother was the weakest of them, and the oldest. She almost didn't make it, but as I said before, they were beaten. They were. They did not know what was going on. They really did not know about the gas chambers around them. They did know, however, that had I been with my mother, they would have never been able to be together. I mean, my mother did survive because I wasn't there. My other aunt, who also had a child my age, the child never came back. And my mother and my aunts came back from the camp. I remember them coming into town. They were all wearing red blouses because they had red flags. The Russians liberated them from the red flags. They made this. So the four ladies arrived in the red.
Made from communist flags.
Made from communist flags, and gray flannel slacks made from blankets. And they told some bad stories about what happened. My mother didn't know too much because she was really in a working camp. My mother didn't know that my father passed away until she came home.
She found out afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
So your mother and all of her sisters survived that way, and then you mentioned the uncle who returned and who actually found you in the home of the individual who was hiding you. Mm-hmm. Tell us about that.
Well, he was young. He was a very handsome young man.
His name is?
Imi. And he took me back home to my house where we used to live with my parents. And the Gestapo headquarters used to be there, so everything was destroyed.
Gestapo headquarters was your house?
Was in my house, yes.
So originally your house was one home that belonged to you. Right. Then it became part of the ghetto. Yes. And there were at least 17 families in it.
Right.
After the ghetto was liquidated, then the Gestapo made a house there, Gestapo headquarters.
Right. So when I got back there with my uncle, there was nothing left. I mean, everything was destroyed, everything was taken. And he hired someone to take care of me and went to Budapest to find my parents. He had no idea where they are. And while he was looking for them among the dead and so on, he got typhus. He contracted and he died. So once again I was left alone.
Do you remember the end of the war? You remember the bombing, clearly, the Allied bombings. Do you remember when the war ended?
Yes. The people that were hiding me came in one morning and said that the Russians are coming and that maybe my parents are coming with them. I mean, the naivety of the people were amazing. And there was big street fights. People were hungry, had no money, no food. They were eating the horses. The horses were killed in the town, and that's what we ate. That's the only food that was around for about 3 weeks. There was no food to be had.
This is while the Russians are attacking in an attempt to capture the city, and the Germans are trying to defend
Yes.
it.
I have one very fond memory of a Russian soldier when he came into the house and wanted to. They looted quite a bit, the Russian soldiers, but this one man started to take some of the things from this family, and they said, well, this is a Jewish child. So he sat down and he left them everything, and he kept coming back and bringing candy and food to the family. And about a week after liberation, he invited all his friends, like 20 Russian soldiers, made a big banquet of food, and I was seated at the head of the table as the young Jewish child, and they danced with me and music. It was amazing.
It's amazing.
And there was no communication. I didn't speak Russian, obviously, but they understood.
Was he a Jewish soldier?
I don't know. I wonder. Had to be.
Well, do you remember his name?
Yes, Joseph.
His last name? And once he discovered that you were Jewish, he brought food for the
Yes.
family, and
Yes.
afterwards established a banquet to celebrate the fact that you had
I
survived.
mean, what a insight this man had, right? Thinking back. And young, he was very young. Remember, he was very young, very jolly and happy man.
When the family walked into the room and told you the war is over, what was your understanding of that? What was your feeling of
That my parents are coming home. But it took a long, long time till my parents finally, my mother finally
mother
got
came
home.
back.
Months and months and months.
And during those months and months, between the time that you knew the war had ended and they actually came into town wearing the red shirts and the gray flannel slacks, what did you do then?
Well, I stayed with a neighbor. I told you my
So you
uncle
left that
died. I was in my house, and the neighbor took me. Then an aunt came from my father's sister came, who is now living in Israel. Her
What's
name
her
is
name?
Beji. Beji.
And her last name?
Schoenfeld. But right now, I mean, her name is different now, but that was my father's sister, younger sister.
Do you remember her married name?
Right now? Yes. My God. Neeman. Neaman.
And she lives in Israel?
Israel, and her husband I think was born in Israel. Dr. Neeman. Emil Neeman. She's my favorite aunt. Oh, I shouldn't say that on tape. She's lovely.
And she took care of you
She took care of me.
after the liberation
Yes.
until the time when your mom and your parents came
Exactly.
back to the town.
Exactly.
How old were you at the liberation?
9 years old.
9 years old.
Yes. And the most interesting part of the liberation to me is I was the only child left in Nyíregyháza. Out of all the Jewish children, not one came back, except
Not
me.
one remained in the town, and not one returned.
Nobody returned.
As
No
far
one.
as you know, you're the only child. that
No, it's
remained.
not as far as I know. It's a fact.
It's a fact.
Because every mother and father that came back after the war used to come to our home after my mother and sisters and all came back just to touch me, I was the most popular kid in town. No, there
The
was
only kid?
no child.
No child survived.
No.
They were all deported to Auschwitz. And
Yes.
that's You had mentioned that you returned to the town after the war to take a look at it and see. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, my husband Stuart, who I met in 1975, was very interested in my story, and I realized that up until then I never spoke about it. And when he only wanted me to go back with him and show him where I was born. So we went back. We went to Budapest, and that was a nice surprise. Budapest is a beautiful city. And then we drove to Nyíregyháza. And I remembered I had a picture of the streets, my home. I was very proud of this house because I remembered it to be a palace. It's not a palace, but I remembered it being one. And we drove into town, and it was so much bigger. They built a lot of different streets. The streets were paved. Some of the streets I remember being dirt roads. And I remembered when my grandmother's house was in grandmother's store. I remembered everything.
And that was still there?
And it was still there. And we went to my street, and I went to my home. And three communist families were living in this house right now. And so we looked around, and all of a sudden, from nowhere, I started to tell my husband that, you see, this is where the German soldiers came into the house and asked me to leave. In the ghetto, when they were taking us away, I wanted a glass of water, and I went to get it, and he said, "Raus, raus." And nobody ever told me to get out in my life. I was a spoiled little girl. And the harshness, I'll never forget that. And I started to explain this to my husband, that here I was in this room, and then the German soldiers were in this room, and all of a sudden, all I could see is German soldiers. So Stuart...
You actually saw them?
I saw them. I saw them. It's the most amazing thing.
You were sure they were there?
And so Stuart got nervous, and he took me out of my home, thinking that once I'm out of the house, it will pass. So we got back in the car, and we started to drive around in town. And then I saw the soldiers. And the worst part of it is I saw all the Hungarian Csender. Csender was a policeman on a horse with a big rooster's feather in his head. And I saw them. I saw them on every corner. And I saw them. I saw. I don't know what they did to me, these guys, but every time I think of them, this part is tough.
So you had to leave the town because that memory was so vivid.
Yeah.
You can't remember if during the time that you were there, these Csenders, they were Nazis, is that correct?
They were Hungarian Nazis,
Yeah.
and it was easy for them just to get off their horse and beating on people.
Without cause.
Yeah.
Do you remember that happened?
Being Jewish is a good cause.
And they were stationed in the ghetto too.
Yes, they were everywhere. They were everywhere. You could see them everywhere.
So, and you and the other Jews were subject to beatings,
Yes.
to violations of your civil rights without cause, without any excuse.
Civil rights, I don't think those words existed among the Jews in Hungary. My father was beaten before he was killed for stealing an apple in concentration camp. So I don't eat apples.
And after 1975, after your trip, you left the town?
Yes, we left the town. We went back to Budapest, and everything was fine the next day. it was a very strange experience.
How did you reach America after the war?
How
How
did
did you
I-
reach America?
My mother remarried, and my stepfather and I were brought here by my uncle.
Oh, Uncle Mickey,
Uncle Mickey.
who had
yes.
been financed by the family in 1939
Right.
to emigrate.
He brought us out. He brought us my aunts, myself, my mother and stepfather. I came to America in 1951, November 30th. And just about this Christmas, I already was working. You know J. Thorpe?
J. Corp.
J. Thorpe
J. Thorpe.
department stores. You wouldn't remember if you were young. It was on 57th Street. And I didn't speak a word of English. And I started to work as a junior model. On the floor I was modeling because you didn't need to speak English.
You were a model.
And then 1955 I got married. 1956 I had my first child. His name is Kenneth, who is now a doctor. 1958 I had my daughter Cherie, who's married and has 2 children.
As a result of the experience that you went through and all that you suffered at that time, is there any message that you would like to tell to the world or to anyone specifically concerning what happened to you and possibly what you think we could learn?
Yeah. Well, I think that in America, the belief that it can't happen is a very scary notion. I think being married to an American and having American children, I understand how they don't understand that it can happen again. And it's very important that we do what we do just now. I don't enjoy doing what I'm doing, telling you my life. I'm very private, and it hurts me to tell you because I don't want anyone to know. But I'm doing it because I think this is important. And if everyone will pitch in and do what I'm doing, and my children will do it, and your children will do it, maybe they won't hate us so much.
I think that Mr. Somerstein is here too. He would like to join us. Is that okay?
That is my mother, Lily Baum, before she was taken to Auschwitz.
So that picture was taken in the ghetto?
Yes. That is my father, Laszlo Schönfeld, about 5 years before the war. That is I, at the age of 3, I think.
What was that the year that they had that special competition for the coffee
Yes,
Poster?
this was one of the pictures that survived.
that were submitted?
Yeah. Mother and I on vacation in a seaside town, I think.
What year was that?
It looks like I'm 2 years old there. Maybe less.
Who's that with you?
That is a friend. I don't know who he is. That is Uncle Bela Baum, who survived the war but died later in a drowning accident. Those are my two cousins that are now living in Israel, and I in the Czechoslovakian Tatra. Right after the war, I'm waiting for my mother to come back from Auschwitz. This is I in München, probably in 1950. Thinking I'm very beautiful, I think.
And there's one picture missing on the upper left hand. What happened to that?
Must have given it to a boyfriend. This is the general steward that brought my stepfather, my mother and I to America. Was in a luxury cruiser.
Which port did you come into?
He came into New York. We left Bremerhaven and came into New York. It was a horrendous trip. It was in November.
And the Statue of Liberty when you first saw it?
Unbelievable. That is an incredible, you can't imagine that feeling. That's unbelievable. This is Kenneth and Cherie at Ken's bar mitzvah, and that's my Lhasa Apso, Tutu. Tutu is no longer with us.
How old was your daughter?
My daughter was born in 58 and Kenneth was born in 56. Don't ask me how old they are because I never remember their ages. I choose not to. Those are my grandchildren, Jade and Bo. It's a recent picture, about a year old.
Where do they live now?
They live in Florida, and they're wonderful children. I love them very much. Bo,
How old is he?
Bo is 11 and Jade is 4. That is Stuart, my husband, and I think that's me.
Milka Somerstein. Mrs. Somerstein, if you would introduce this handsome gentleman on your right to us.
What's your name?
This is my handsome husband, Stuart Somerstein.
Mr. Somerstein, is there anything that you would like to say? That you would like to tell us?
The experience of being married to someone who came through the prosecution of the Holocaust has helped me understand what human beings can do to one another, and it has helped me to understand my Jewishness a little bit more and to make me proud of being a Jew. And I hope that for generations, for time immemorial, will understand the terrible genocide that was perpetrated on the Jewish race and mankind of that time. And I hope that all generations will learn from it and not ever allow it to happen again. My wife has been scarred by this, and she has survived obviously very well, and I hope that I've lent something to that, because she has contributed greatly to the happiness of society through her work and through her charitable efforts.
Mrs. Somerstein had mentioned that during the years she really did not think very much about this. And actually, after meeting you in 1975, you had prompted her to, you wanted to see the town that she had come from, to return to that area. What made you feel that that would be important?
I thought it was important after we got to know each other that she admitted to me that she never spoke about it. She never discussed her childhood with her children or with anyone, or even her ex-husband for that matter. And I wanted to bring it out in her because I thought it would be important for her psychological well-being to be able to share this terrible tragedy with not only myself, but with her children and the other people that she loves. And I thought it would be important to go back to her roots, where she never was until, a good 30 years later, maybe more. And I was proud of doing that, but I was unhappy with the experience that she had when she returned home. We drove from Budapest to Nyíregyháza, and when we arrived there, she was very excited and happy to be back where she grew up, and then the realization of what happened there snapped in her brain, and it brought back such horrible memories that we had to leave, because all she could remember were the Nazis and the terrible experience that happened from that point on. But I think it helped her understand what happened during that time. And then just 2 years ago, we went to a concentration camp in Mauthausen, where her father was killed. And
it's a terrible place.
sorry. And the realization of seeing that was the worst experience of my life. For her, sadness, and just for the actuality of how anything like that could be perpetrated on humanity was just unbelievable to me. I'm sorry. But
There were school children there, which was very nice to see. Remember?
yes.
Tell them about that.
What was more interesting, I thought, but as interesting as the school children, every country, from Albania to Hungary, and every Iron Curtain country, and every Western European country, had erected monuments to the people that were lost. And there were hundreds, literally hundreds, maybe thousands of individual memorial plaques to people that were lost there, from Spanish people to Ukrainian people to Austrian people, Jewish people, etc. And that really is a living memorial to the unfortunate people that lost their lives there. And it was to see how this camp operated, and to see there was a cliff of maybe 300 feet down, and on the cliff they used to just line up the people and push them over. It was just unbelievable. And the children that we saw there
They're not Jewish children.
were not Jewish children, and yet they were
Interested enough to come there, which was wonderful to see.
and to learn what it was like. And I think what you are doing is helping to show the generations of the future that this can never happen again.
I want to take this opportunity to thank you, Mr. Somerstein, for allowing us to come into your home, being so gracious to us. And I want to reassure you that all of the knowledge that comes from this effort will be put to the kind of good use that you both spoke about, so that the world may know, so that the world may remember, and with God's help, this may never happen again.
Amen.